Hey there, and welcome to Explosive Enterprises. Today we're going to be sticking with our theme of actually looking at some explosives every once in a while with our first hand grenade review, showcasing the 40 Max Whirligig II. Full disclosure here, we were given both a prototype and a production model of this grenade for free by 40 Max, with no conditions attached apart from requesting that we put up a video review and asking for feedback on the prototype model that they might integrate into the production version. So anything you see here is our unvarnished opinion. So that said, for starters, this thing pretty much does what it says on the tin. As the name implies, the grenade functions by rapidly spinning while ejecting BBs in random directions. This is not a new concept, and if you're an elderly airsofter like we are, you might remember the Airsoft Innovations Tornado grenade coming out back in 2008, which pioneered the idea. Prior to the Tornado, BB launching grenades were, frankly, terrible. This was a common design, which was an absolute pain in the ass to rearm, and at best threw the BBs a few feet from the grenade with a weak pop. Other designs, like the one from Deepfire, had slightly better performance, but had the outer case of the shell actually fly off to release the BBs, which meant constantly replacing lost or damaged pieces, and made the entire arrangement extremely fragile. Generally, if you wanted a decent airsoft grenade, you were using actual pyro-based pea grenades, which were, and still are, pretty expensive, single-use, and are generally not allowed at indoor fields. Nowadays, tornado-style grenades are pretty much the market standard for gas-powered BB launching grenades, and the Whirligig II is no exception. And again, as the name implies, this is the second version of this grenade that 40 Max has developed. I've actually played with the original version, purchased with my own money, pretty extensively, and honestly wasn't the biggest fan of it. Though it was exceptionally cheap for this type of hand grenade, it took a lot of force to set off, and seemed to have issues actually ejecting the entire load of gas and BBs when thrown. So, is version 2 an improvement? Let's take a look. The way these grenades function is pretty simple. You've got a spiral track containing the load of BBs, a gas reservoir, and some sort of valve to release the gas in said reservoir. Conceptually, this is identical to how 40mm shells like the 40 Mic and 40 Max Cyclops work, except with these hand grenades there's no barrel and the BBs exit the grenade at a 90-degree angle. Since that exhaust port is also offset from the center axis of the grenade, the jet of gas created when the grenade is triggered also imparts spin on the body of the grenade, and you get this tornado effect, or in this case, whirligig effect, which does a good job of dispersing the BBs in all directions. Materials-wise, this thing feels pretty well built, and is definitely a step up compared to the first version. Both ends of the grenade are covered by rubber caps made from thermoplastic polyurethane, familiar to anybody that works with 3D printers as TPU, which is some pretty tough stuff. The caps are designed in such a way that they provide some standoff from the main body, so that when the grenade lands on a flat surface, the rubber caps will always be the first thing to hit the ground, taking the brunt of the impact, which is a pretty smart idea. You can see some slight differences between the caps on the prototype and the production model, but those appear to just be cosmetic. The main body is made of aluminum, which helps keep the whole grenade fairly light at 10.7 ounces, or around 300 grams, which is good when you're going to be throwing this thing at people. Next, we're going to take a look at the internals, but we're going to preface that by saying we honestly don't recommend taking this thing apart unless you absolutely have to repair it. It's extremely annoying to disassemble and reassemble, and it's a simple enough mechanism that you hopefully won't have to do too much maintenance on it anyway. Step 1 is to pry this top TPU cap off. This takes so much force that I honestly thought it was glued on for the first few weeks that I had the prototype in hand, but it turns out that it's just difficult to remove due to the fact that the cap serves as part of the cam mechanism that acts as the grenade's safety. And no, the cap doesn't interface with another part that acts as the cam. The rubber cap is literally molded to act as the cam. I'm not sure that's a great idea from a long-term durability perspective, and that means that if something happens to that cap, like if you damaged it during the removal process, you're kind of out of luck. Anyway, once you have that cap off, you have access to the top of the trigger mechanism. The entire trigger mechanism can unscrew from the main body of the grenade, which reveals the single milled plastic part that functions as the gas reservoir and the spiral BB track. Much like the 40 Max Cyclops shells, the plastic reservoir means you need to stick to propane for this one. Before we break the trigger mechanism down, we can see how it actually works, which is pretty clever. When the grenade is empty of gas, you can see this big bearing here just kind of flops around on this stem, but is kept pressed against this blue seal by this weak spring. When you fill the reservoir up with gas, the pressure inside of the reservoir pushes that bearing even harder into the seal. If you think about it though, nothing but the gas pressure and the force of that spring is actually preventing that bearing from coming away from the seal. And, given that it's a pretty chunky piece of metal that would retain its momentum pretty well, the force of, say, falling onto concrete from a few feet up would definitely be enough to dislodge the bearing from the seal, allowing all of that pent-up propane to rush out of the grenade, into the spiral BB track, and out the exhaust port, taking all those BBs with it, and hopefully into your opponents. Oh, and the safety that we mentioned functions by using the cam track from the TPU cap to pull up on this pin, which is attached to the stem that's attached to the bearing, which pulls the bearing into the seal even harder and locks it in place. And since the bearing is now locked in place, it can't release any of the gas, which means the grenade can't go off. With that said, let's get back to the disassembly. To break down the trigger mechanism, you start by removing this pin, as well as this small torsion spring, being careful not to let that fly across the room, and the removal of that allows you to punch the rest of the mechanism out the bottom of the housing. If needed, you can remove the bottom rubber cap from the grenade by removing these two screws, and that gives you easy access to the fill valve should you need to service that. And that's the grenade fully disassembled. If you do so happen to have this thing taken apart, maintenance-wise, all the O-rings you see on the grenade can be hit with some super lube or an equivalent, and the fill valve can be removed and maintained as we've discussed in our previous videos on GBB maintenance. The blue seal shouldn't require any lubricants or greases, but ensure that it's free of debris or anything that might otherwise compromise that sealing surface. Reassembly is pretty straightforward. It's basically just disassembling it, but in reverse. Except for this pain-in-the-ass little spring, which needs to be forced and held into this channel using some sort of appropriately shaped tool, while you use your other hand to force the pin through it. I settled on these old flat-nosed pliers, but I'm sure there's some other tools that would work as well.
A few minutes later. 2 hours later.
Once you get that back in, you force the top rubber cap back on using one of the more technically sophisticated ORC-approved methods, otherwise known as bashing it against something until it's fully seated. The loading process is fairly simple. You need to check to make sure the grenade fuse is in the off position, fill it with gas, and then use a speed loader to load up to 200 BBs in through the exhaust port. The BBs tend to bind up a bit while they navigate the spiral, so it can help to shake the grenade around a bit as you load it. And yeah, that's it. No resetting, no pins to reinsert, nothing. All you do is rotate the top cap to the on position, and you're ready for fragging. Seriously though, off and on? Couldn't they have gone with safe and armed? Maybe just lost in translation. As an aside, at a glance, it's pretty much impossible to tell if this thing's armed or safed, and maybe I'm just old school, but I personally don't really like the feeling of rotating the cap to arm it versus pulling a pin and having a spoon. On the flip side, no pins or spoons to lose either, so your mileage may vary there. One of the first things we look at when it comes to impact grenades is how sensitive the fuse is, since the actual BB launching performance doesn't really matter that much if the grenade never actually goes off. My usual indoor field is a converted soccer practice arena with soft turf flooring, which is usually pretty awful for impact grenades, including both the first version of this Whirligig grenade and this ASG Storm 360 that one of my teammates loaned me. The Whirligig II has no trouble with this turf surface, and certainly doesn't have any trouble with hard concrete. Though, of note, we did test it on some actual outdoor grass surfaces and did have some trouble getting it to go off, even when dropped straight on the base. Now, in terms of the BB launching performance, it does pretty much all you could ask from this type of grenade. The 200 BB capacity is at the very high, if not actual, top end of the market, with most other grenades falling into the 150 to 170 BB capacity range, and though an extra 30-ish BBs probably isn't going to be a huge game changer, it certainly doesn't hurt. Due to the low weight and the fact that this grenade holds a bit more gas than others of the type, it also has a very strong spin, especially on hard surfaces, which ensures good coverage in a full 360-degree pattern. In fact, the spin might actually be a bit too strong, as we actually observe this thing flying off into the air or spinning off into other rooms entirely when triggered on hard surfaces. As usual, let's cap this off by going through the positives and the negatives. Starting with the positives, it is definitely more sensitive than other grenades in this category, which is helpful if you plan on playing on softer surfaces like turf or maybe even firmer grass. It has a high capacity and a very strong spin, which ensures good BB coverage in all directions, as one would hope from this kind of grenade. The twist-to-arm design means that you aren't going to be hunting down lost spoons and pins like you inevitably will be with other brands of hand grenade. And something that we didn't note previously, it actually makes quite a bit of noise for a BB launching grenade, which is very helpful for getting people to actually call their hits from it. For negatives, we'll start off with the fact that it's kind of a pain to disassemble. As we mentioned, it's a pretty simple design, so hopefully it doesn't require too much maintenance, but I wouldn't want to be regularly taking this thing apart to service the O-rings, and though 40 Max does usually sell spare parts for their products, as of this recording, none appear to be for sale. Now, while that twist-to-arm design does reduce logistics, it also makes it very difficult to tell if the grenade is armed or disarmed at a glance, and at least for me personally, doesn't feel as good as a pin and spoon does ergonomically. And finally, the spin might actually be a bit too strong in some cases, and the grenade is fully capable of flying a pretty good distance from the actual point of impact. It might be worth painting this thing bright orange just to make tracking it down a bit easier, especially at outdoor fields. So, as of recording, the Whirligig II is not available directly in the US, but is available overseas, currently selling for a bit less than twice what the original version was sold for, putting it right around the same price as competing grenades from ASG and Swiss Arms. And that about does it for this one. If you have any questions or want to let us know what you think of the review, leave a comment below. And if you're interested in supporting us further, check out our merch store and pick up a patch or a shirt. Thanks for watching.